Okay, this one's been very long in coming, so I'm finally back with part three of the Invasion Threat series. This one's taken me a while to put together for various reasons, as we'll see in the video. But we're back now, and yeah, I've been really looking forward to doing this one for a long time. As always, in terms of the vast amount of information I have to try and remember, I'm using a script for this one, so it's quite likely that I'll lose my place where I am, and start to fumble stuff. But the aim of these talks is just to be more of an informal talk. You know, like I say, I don't like to. I don't know what to say. Put a lot of effort into these things. I just like to get the information across and have a nice little presentation and a chat. But yeah, it's taken me a while to do this one because firstly, I was trying to find a logical way to present the information in chronological order. So, if you've watched the other videos in this series, I'm trying to start from like 1939 and go all the way up to, I think I've set a date for like December 1942, which we'll see the reasons for that later in the future. And splitting 1940 up is just messed my head up a bit trying to work out a way of doing it because yeah, I was thinking that I'd cover it in three like quarterly three nice chunks, you know, going from like early to mid to late, and then covering late or something like that. And that didn't quite work out because the situation changed, not how in a way that I wasn't expecting, let's say. So after the last video, we looked at the invasion threats from the perspective of the defenders. Coming into 1940, the situation in terms of areas vulnerable to invasion remained unchanged for the initial months of 1940, which is one of the reasons why it's made it a bit difficult for me to kind of split this up into a logical chronological sequence. But the situation changed suddenly in April 1940 with the German invasion of Denmark and Norway, which, as you'll find out in this presentation, and as I often go on about, is often forgotten. So let's start with my usual spiel. So as always, it doesn't matter if you don't think if you think the invasion threat from Germany wasn't viable or they weren't seriously never planned to actually invade, etc., etc. This is not relevant at all. The series is presenting the actual threats of invasion as determined at the time by the various arms of the military. This threat was clearly taken very seriously by the military at the time, and the military command and various others clearly thought that invasion was possible and even extremely likely at times. As with the previous videos, I need to reiterate further that the aim of the series is to present the perceived invasion threats through the eyes of the defenders, not the attackers. The invasion threat against the UK during the Second World War is pretty much always looked at from the perspective of the invading force, using their plans, such as Operation Sea Lion, for example, as a means of assessing the invasion threat. But the threat of invasion as seen by the defenders, the home forces, is rarely actually considered. So this often gives many people the impression that the threat of invasion only focused on the south coast of England, for example, following the fall of France. This skews public opinion and also hinders an accurate assessment of the invasion threats the home forces were reacting to and the invasion threats that they aim to defend against. In terms of my work, for example, and my research, understanding the perspective of the defenders can help me to better understand trends in defences and better understand the rationale behind their use, deployment and geographical location. So from my experience as an archaeologist, in archaeology, context is key, and understanding, in this case, the historical context of these defences is not only aiding my interpretation at a national and local scale, but also helping me to better understand the reasons why the country was defended, for example. So with that out of the way, let's get into a bit more information. So the aim of these talks as well is for me to present the source of information, historical information, primary sources that I'm using. And this is something that's rarely done in historical YouTube videos as a presentation, so I want to be a bit different and show my working out. So in maths, you're expected to show you working out to show how you got your conclusion. This is exactly the same in historical research, and this is something that I'm very keen to show. So, as always, I'm using, or where possible, using a range of primary sources to put together these overviews of the invasion threats. These are generally, in particular, war diaries, command files, and war cabinet files and memoranda. So these help to demonstrate the actual picture when it comes to the invasion threats, rather than supposition and misguided modern perceptions which focus on dismissing the invasion threat out of hand or using hindsight. So I'll provide the references for the source I've used at the bottom of the relevant slides, such as these ones here, and I've used primarily in this video the Cabinet War files which are available by the National Archives in the UK. Where possible as well, I've also fallen back or used, where possible, the trusty war diaries, which are one of my favourite sources of information. But I will highlight in this later on one of the issues I encountered later in the presentation in using the war diaries. So let's get on with the main bit of the main body. Let's get on with it. So, Unternehmen Weserübung, or Operation Weserübung, was the invasion of Norway and Denmark, which commenced on the 9th of April 1940. And this, in terms of a knock-on effect, in terms of the invasion threats against the UK, had a massive influence on how the invasion threat was perceived, and marked a significant and very quick change in terms of like the invasion threat going south very quickly for the defenders. So I'm not going to go into too much detail of this. I'm sure there's other videos and other content you can find relating to Operation Weserübung online. It's, as I've said before, and as I like to state, I'm not an expert in the German side of things, so I'd rather leave that to people who are more knowledgeable. But yeah, so please do seek out information on this. I'm just highlighting this to kind of like form the context for which we'll be doing our assessment. So this took place from the 9th of April 1940 to the 10th of June 1940. We're going to focus on the reaction, or the period from April to mainly April 1940. May 1940 in terms of the home forces. So up until the invasion of Norway and Denmark, the situation in terms of the threat of invasion against the UK and the intelligence picture remained relatively similar to that as it was first assessed in late 1939. And this is as far as I can see in the source documents that I have available, that is. So there might be other information elsewhere. I'm just basing this on the source of information that I've consulted. Consult is the word, that's the one I'm looking for. And this is primarily the Cabinet War files, which provide a really nice overview of the situation in terms of the intelligence picture and the threats of invasion. So, with Norway and Denmark falling under the Nazi jackboots by the 10th of June 1940, this further exposed the east coast of the UK to the threat of invasion, with the possibility of the invading force not only coming from ports in northern Germany, but now from the coasts and ports of Denmark and Norway. So for an overview of this, see my previous videos in this series if you haven't already. So just to give you a visual, this is the kind of situation before Weserübung. Oh, I've missed the umlaut off there, that's going to annoy me. This was the situation before Weserübung took place. So red indicates enemy or occupied countries, green friendly or friendly, let's just say friendly, and blue neutral countries. The east coast of the UK was under threat, but invasion fleets could only sail from a limited selection of ports in northern Germany and from ports on the Baltic coast via the Denmark Strait. So this meant that, in terms of the threat of invasion, I'm going to try not to go off on a tangent because I've already done this. The main areas of where the invasion threat could come was primarily East Anglia and parts of the Yorkshire and Lincolnshire coast, mainly the Humber and East Anglia, for example. But watch my previous videos for that. Following the fall of Norway and Denmark, this is what the situation looked like in terms of geography, or the geographical context. So during and after the fall of Norway and Denmark, this is what the military in the UK faced in a geographical sense. The east coast of the UK was now directly faced by additional ports and airfields from which an invading fleet and aircraft could be launched. The North Sea was also more vulnerable as a result as well, in terms of the German Navy now having access to bases much closer to the east coast of the UK. The proximity as well of the Shetland Isles to Norway is also something that worried the chiefs of staff quite considerably. And as I always like to point out, as soon as I mention this online, the threat to the Shetland Islands or the Shetland Isles is often dismissed when I mention it online. But as we'll see later, the threat to Shetland was a very real one, and when it comes to the military top brass, they were very concerned about the proximity of the Shetland Isles to the coast of Norway. Right, so in terms of this presentation, I've mainly focused on the War Cabinet files, or the Cabinet War files, as they're called. And these are a bunch of documents relating to assessments undertaken for the Cabinet, that is the British political organisation. So I've used Cabinet War files as a primary source of information, in particular the reports of the Chiefs of Staff Committee and the Joint Intelligence Staff Subcommittee, I think it is, or the Joint Intelligence Subcommittee. So just to outline, for those of you who are not aware, the Chiefs of Staff Committee was a committee formed of all leading members of the various arms of the military, so Army, Navy, Air Force, primarily. Their role was to assess and advise on military operations, so assessing various situations and providing reports and information to the War Cabinet to allow decisions to be made. So the impression from the public today, or in most people's heads, is that the Prime Minister just made decisions and they were in charge of everything absolutely, and it was the responsibility of those, the military below him to undertake his orders. The reality is that the decisions of the Prime Minister were informed and guided by an experienced military staff. So they informed the Prime Minister to allow them to, and the various War Cabinet officers to make their decisions. It wasn't the Prime Minister didn't just go, right, we're going to do this, and the military had to listen to that. There was a lot of to and fro, and a lot of expertise was provided to inform decisions that were made. In kind of alongside this, the Joint Intelligence Subcommittee, that's the term I was after, is similar but focused on assessing intelligence and building up the intelligence picture for consumption by the military and cabinet ministers. That was a very long sentence to read. So the Chiefs of Staff covered military operations, while the Joint Intelligence Subcommittee focused on the intelligence picture and assessing intelligence to build up the intelligence picture. Right. So, in terms of the invasion threat to the UK following the commencement of the invasion of Norway, the first reassessment of the invasion threat was presented to the War Cabinet's Chief of Staff Committee by the Joint Intelligence Subcommittee on the 3rd of May 1940. So this was only a couple of days after, it's quite a while after the invasion had taken place. I'll have to double check if that date's right. It should be right, yeah. So this simple report, it was only a couple of pages, provided some analysis of the situation following the invasion of Norway and Denmark, but ultimately concluded that little needed to change in terms of the invasion threat, in terms of the invasion threat assessment that was conducted in November 1939. And this was the threat assessment that was used to inform the Julius Caesar plan on which that was based. So by the 3rd of May 1940, it was assessed that very little needed to be done to change the assessment that had already been made in November 1939. But there were a couple of things that stand out about in this. So one thing that did stand out to me while reading through this was that this information on the loss of navy and naval ships and merchants in the Norwegian campaign from the Kriegsmarine and the German perspective. So it was determined that this meant that Germany didn't have the resources to launch a serious invasion at the time, by the 3rd of May 1940, but the Royal Navy should not be dispersed, as this may have tempted the German High Command into invading the mainland UK. So it's interesting to note here that the loss of shipping, so one thing that made me, a light bulb went off in my head as soon as I read this, and it made me wonder whether the loss of shipping in the Norwegian campaign influenced German preparations later for the invasion of the UK, meaning that they had to source invasion shipping from elsewhere, such as using Rhine barges, for example, and converting those. So yeah, one thing, kind of rhetorical question or something that if anyone knows, this loss of shipping may have influenced German preparations for invasion later on in the year following the fall of France. So something to consider later on, and point of discussion in the chat if anyone's up for that. Because I don't know, did it not? Who knows? Anyway, so there was also further assessment of the use of paratroops during the invasion of Norway as well. So a bit of information, a bit of an assessment looking at how the Germans had used paratroops in the invasion of Norway, for example. So excuse me, that was something to highlight. Next slide. So, as I always like to try and put across, the intelligence picture constantly influenced the assessment of the invasion threat, so the situation was always fluid. So by the 5th of May, just 2 days after this initial assessment had been provided, the situation had changed, with the assessment updated and a detailed report provided on the situation as it was on the 5th of May 1940. So what's nice about this is that we're seeing here from a primary source how the intelligence picture was built up and how the intelligence picture was used to change assessments of the invasion. So I've got an itchy nose now. Yeah. So as I've just said, the situation was fluid, and this is why the invasion threat is much more complex than has ever been presented. The military organisation responsible for planning the defence of the UK was a massively professional military organisation with a vast range of experience, and it acted as it always has, as a professional organisation. And this is why the belief that the defence of the UK was unprofessional, haphazard, not taken seriously, or poorly coordinated needs to be broken down, as it's ultimately harmful to our understanding of this period of history. So it's highlighted in the initial notes on this report that the assessment has started on the 29th of April with the Chief of Staff instructed to re-examine the existing plans for the defence of the UK and make their assessment again. Also of interest was a recommendation by the First Lord of the Admiralty to withdraw regular army battalions from India, which is really, really interesting, as well as the need to learn from German military standard operating procedures, as they are called today, and to react to this information to develop safeguards to current German SOPs, or operating procedures as a modern term. Again, this further highlights that the military were keen to learn as much as they could about the enemy to adapt to their way of fighting. Again, flying completely in the face of this idea that the defence of the UK was not prepared and was always on the back foot in terms of reacting to the enemy. The military top brass, as a catch-all term, were very keen to learn from what the Germans were doing and adapt to German military doctrine. Again, showing the professionalism of the organisation, and again, flying in the face that we were never prepared, or the UK was never prepared, and just was constantly on the back foot. Right, next slide. So this introductory page is then followed up by a draft report, which is extremely detailed, and this starts by outlining its conclusions. So I'm going to kind of summarize this. You can find these files online if you really want to have a look into them. They are massively detailed, and I do recommend you have a read through them. This is my summary based on what I read. So the report starts by outlining its conclusions, and directly relating to the invasion threat against the UK, the document highlights the following. So the possibility of small scale raids remained on the east coast of the UK, but is now extended to the Shetland Isles. So looking at these reports in comparison with the Julius Caesar plan documents, the potential for coastal raids was realised by the military and taken into account. So I had to look through my previous videos, and this is something I didn't pick up on. So I'm just going to say here that I didn't pick up on this in my previous videos, and I'm fairly certain that I overlooked the possibility of raiding, as I don't remember it being considered within the Julius Caesar plan documents. So it's worth me clarifying here that small-scale raids were seen by the COSC, or the Chief of Staff Committee, so I'm going to call them the COSC from here on. And the possibility of raiding often crops up today, but often in light of, so whenever people ask me about raiding, it's often in light of the coastal defence as being purely built as a form of protection against small-scale raids and not full-blown invasion, when the reality is that they were built to protect against full-scale invasion, and therefore were able to defend against small-scale raids. But small-scale raids were clearly a concern for the COSC. Next, it was clear in terms of a full-on invasion or full-scale invasion that to support a full-scale invasion, Germany would need a high degree of air superiority, which is what we saw, happening with the Battle of Britain. Such air superiority was needed to give protection to the invasion fleet and the bridgehead on land, as well as to provide support to the invading force on land, as well as providing forms of striking against the defenders by the enemy. So providing air support to the invading fleet and enemy shipping, or their shipping, the bridgehead on land, and supporting the invading force as it pushed inland. Again, quite prescient here is that the report mentions that Holland would need to be captured, and the capture of this was would have been key to an invasion of the UK. And again, this is something that's very prescient from the COSC. On the 5th of May, they were considering the potential or the need for the Germans to capture Holland before it happened. So it shows that the knowledge of the COSC and of the wider strategic situation and the potential for future enemy strategic operations was clearly something that was considered. There's a lot of foresight going on here. So the COSC knew full well what they were doing, and yeah, they also outlined that the invasion was likely to be preceded by an intense aerial bombardment, and if that's that if Germany occupies Holland, that it would be unwise for them to underestimate the opposition and the possibility of the Luftwaffe securing air superiority as well. So they didn't just brush off the threat and go, oh, it's not going to happen. They were making it abundantly clear here not to underestimate the enemy and underestimate their ability to secure air superiority where required. Oh, sorry, my nose again. Yeah. Right. So, as I like to say, this is meant to be a more laid-back chat, and you get action of me rubbing my nose because I've got an itchy nose. Right. So after this introductory section, the report goes into a lot of detail regarding the invasion threat. So I'm not going to cover this in minute detail myself, but we'll highlight some of the points that I found most interesting. So, yeah, so this is, I've changed this around a bit and got myself lost. So one of the conclusions in regards to, or some of the conclusions in regards to the invasion threat was that the area, so the area of likely enemy invasions and landings as part of a full-scale invasion was further assessed, as well as the likelihood of this seaborne invasion. So some of the conclusions I made here is that a landing attempt was most likely to happen in the area between the Wash and Newhaven on the south coast. So you've got the Wash at the top end of East Anglia, and all the way down to Newhaven on the south coast was the area where the enemy were likely to land, and that also diversionary raids are likely to take place prior to, the main attack. So diversionary raids were most likely to take place on the Shetland Isles and also potentially the coast of Scotland. So this is what that looks like. So this area from the Wash in red all the way down to Newhaven was seen as the main areas of landing, with the Shetland Isles and the coast of Scotland in blue highlighted as the main areas where areas vulnerable to raids, possibly diversionary in nature as a preliminary to invasion of the south coast. So the idea was that, the Germans, or the thought from the COSC was that the Germans might raid the coast of Scotland, raid Shetland to try and divert troops north, and then hit the southeast coast and the south coast. So that was one of the key assessments here that I thought I'd visualise, and I've changed my slides just before presentation and messed that up a bit. Right. One of the other little snippets of information, again, that cropped up was this in relation to the German naval force. And this is something that, to me, as far as I'm aware, I'm not a naval expert and the Navy side of things aren't my thing, but this seems to often go unobserved, is that the loss the Kriegsmarine suffered during the invasion of Norway and Denmark. And this would have obviously had a knock-on effect in terms of invasion of the UK. So the COSC clearly saw that these losses would have hampered an invasion of the UK at the time of writing, so as of the 5th of May. They also assess here that the capture of southern ports of Norway gave the Germans bases close to the northern UK, making naval bases more vulnerable, so Scapa Flow, naval bases on the east coast, for example, as well as allowing the enemy to make surprise attacks against the Shetland Isles and Scotland at the same time as a full-scale invasion of the southeast, so making this a distinct possibility. Next, and this was something that really, really stood out to me. And this was a short section on kind of like lessons learned, but also a failure on the part of the COSC. And they are, this is extremely professional, and they highlight that they failed to appreciate the situation. So one of the lessons learned was that they actually underestimated the enemy and signs of an invasion of Norway, which is highlighted in part 9 here. So have a quick read of that if you want to pause the video. And also it's seen the invasion of Norway may actually be a precursor to forcing capitulation of the UK. So again, this is extremely prescient and extremely prescient thing. The Germans were kind of hoping that this may have been a precursor to the Germans hoping that the UK would sue for peace. And again, there's a prescient assessment here as well. I'm using that word a lot. That if the Low Countries fell, that invasion was a serious possibility. Again, showing that the invasion threat or invasion itself was taken extremely seriously at the time, as opposed to how it is seen today. Right, so have a little bit of a close look at raids. So, as with all this, I'll leave it up to you to source the full document to read it if you want to. You'll learn a lot from this if you do. So this section, looking at raids, reiterates the potential for raids on the east coast as far north as Shetland, and that these are likely to be for diversionary purposes. But note as well the mention of raids may also focus on isolated military targets such as RDF stations, so radar direction finding stations or radar stations. Sorry, radio direction finding stations or radar stations. And this brings to mind the Bruneville raid, for example, much later on in the war, which was undertaken by the airborne, so the paratroopers, to capture radar equipment from the Germans. So again, this is something that I'm often asked about before. This is something I'm often asked about either in person or online, and it's and it's often before this kind of precedes the idea that the coastal crust defences were built solely to prevent raids on radar stations. They weren't. They were built to protect the coast against invasion. So obviously the coastal crust defences weren't built solely for raids, but it's interesting to see here that raids on isolated radar station was flagged up in this report. And there's also interesting mention of the fifth column supporting such raids too as well in this last sentence. Here. And also this last sentence as well is also very, very, very interesting, that they do not want to overestimate the probability of this form of action, which demands a high degree of individual initiative for which the Germans are not conspicuous. Nevertheless, it would be very unwise to ignore this danger. So they're saying here, kind of like giving a slight to Germans that they're not conspicuous of doing these raids and things like that, but it should not be underestimated. Next, seaborne invasion itself. So there's further assessment of seaborne invasion. This is covered in extreme detail, as you'd expect. But note, it's worth noting that the COSC assessed that the concentration of troops in preparation for invasion by the enemy would likely be noticed by them, but the exact time of sailing would remain unknown to the defenders. So, yeah, that's interesting to know. Also, the requirement of the enemy to be able to put vehicles ashore is a further thing. So the assessment now is that the Germans would aim to land on beaches where they can put vehicles ashore to assist in their push inland. And this is also an interesting development from the Julius Caesar plan. From memory, that focused on the use of using ports to disembark vehicles, while now the situation is the belief that the Germans would just land vehicles on beaches and would seek out viable beaches or stretch the beach where they could do this. And there's also as well a bit of like a contradiction here in that it's assessed now that the enemy apparently now has plenty of ships to support an invasion. So we've seen that an assessment 2 days before where the German merchant fleet and Kriegsmarine lacked ships to do an invasion, and now they've apparently got enough ships to actually support an invasion fleet. So yeah, and just in detail here, let's have a look at these last two paragraphs looking at the invasion. So firstly, the likely area of invasion was between the Wash and Newhaven, as we'd already highlighted, but it also shares here that a landing on the south coast, so around the area of Newhaven, was seen as less likely due to having to pass through the Straits of Dover, which were heavily defended, and also the longer passage from German or Dutch ports, which is interesting, the mention of Dutch ports, because the Netherlands hadn't actually been invaded yet by the 5th of May. Very interesting stuff. It also mentions here as well that landing at ports including Yarmouth, Harwich, Dover and Newhaven was also unlikely because they were heavily defended, but beaches suitable for landing were present on the east and south coasts. So I think we can discount the potential for landing on the south coast here, even though the area of Harwich was highlighted as a potential risk from landings in the initial sections of this paragraph. So there is a bit of kind of disparity here. close detail on the Shetland raids, and it's, I've put this in here. Though we're nearly done with this document, I needed to put the primary source in terms of the Shetland Isles in here, because there's people out there that won't believe me or don't believe me quite often. So I thought I'd stick this in there to kind of cover my own backside and to show that this is not complete bull. So this paragraph draws attention to the possibility that even a diversionary raid on Shetland may secure control of the islands if the garrison there was not sufficient, as even a small force could potentially capture the main islands. So the main islands of the Shetlands. So the capture of Norwegian ports and airfields could facilitate this and support the invading force with supplies. And an interesting stat here is the assessment that Stavanger airfield, I'm sure that's how you pronounce it, or I apologise if not, was only 230 miles from the Shetlands and could actually be used for aircraft dropping paratroops and supplies as well. So 230 miles, I haven't done the maths on this or worked it out, but that's a very short distance in terms of aircraft flight time. I'm going to assume it's about, let's say, an hour's flight, if you're travelling at 230 knots, for example, or an hour and a half. So that's a very short window of time. So an assessment here is that the garrison for defence would therefore be focused around Lerwick, the capital, and also a key port, so it's a lovely place. And also Sombra, where the island's airfield was located. I've done a lot of work. Well, I spent a couple of months digging in around Sombra on the Brock site next to the airfield. That was absolutely cracking. So the defences should focus around Lerwick, key port, and Sombra, the island's main airfield. So these would have been two key pieces of military infrastructure that would need to be captured by an invading force. Right. So, coming on to the 10th of May. So we're still not done. There's a lot of information here that I want to cover, and I'm aware that we're over half an hour already, but I'm just going to keep on going because this is really interesting stuff. The 10th of May saw a further assessment undertaken and issued. So this report was compiled by the COSC again, but also with the Ministry of Home Security. So you've got these two organisations working on putting together this report on the seaborne and airborne, or the threats of the seaborne and airborne attack on the United Kingdom. So this came 5 days after the previous document. So this is very similar to the 5th of May report. It doesn't necessarily add a whole lot more information, but the likely landing area has actually been cut down to an area between the Wash and Folkestone. So still on the south coast, but no longer as far west as New Haven, and also continues to outline the possible possibility of diversionary raids on Scotland and Shetland still remaining. So just to kind of show that, the red area in the southeast and south coast has been quite significantly truncated, putting the invasion threat down to an area from the Wash all the way across the East Anglian coast down to Folkestone. And again, Shetland and the Scottish coast remain vulnerable to potential diversionary raids. So, also mentioned in this little report here is that they've taken action to defend the Shetlands, and steps have been taken to, or were being taken to, provide a much more suitable garrison for the Shetland Isles. So the garrison was under review and steps were being taken to strengthen it, following an in-person inspection of the Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces. So the Commander-in-Chief was going to get shipped up to the Shetland, have a look around and make his assessment as to what course of action to take in terms of the garrison. So I like to point this out because this shows that, within 5 days of this assessment being made, action is being taken by the military to address this concern. And again, this flies in the face of the perception that action was slow and unorganised and disorganised and all that. So, what we got next? Annex 2, so just quick mention here. It's good to know that by the 10th of May, I was just reading my previous notes there. There was an additional annex in this report which goes into even more detail about the current invasion threats. And obviously I've put this in here preempting this. This video is already very long, so let me just summarise the more interesting parts of this. So further assessment. More detail by this point had gone into an assessment of the airborne force landing in the UK. So with a landing of 5,000 paratroops being possible, with the Germans having enough transport aircraft to transport a total of 11,000 paratroops. which is a figure we saw mentioned in a previous section. In terms of the seaborne force, the enemy was likely to try and capture a landing place and use this to create a bridgehead to secure ports and harbours to supply the main force. So this is something we see much later on. So the idea now is that the Germans aren't going to necessarily go straight for a port. They're going to land on beaches, create a bridgehead, and push out from that bridgehead to secure ports and harbours from which to support their main force. And this is something we'll see much later on in terms of the defensive picture. So a key point here as well is that I haven't come across before is that the invading force would likely choose places to land and ports to capture based on their reconnaissance of minefields protecting the coast. And also potentially using movements of Allied shipping to recce safe areas of passage through the minefields and also identify swept channels. So this is really interesting. So minesweeping by the enemy may also accompany the invading fleet. So if you watch my future videos, remember this, because this is going to be a very key point in my next video. So yeah, this interesting mention of the Germans potentially recceing minefields on the coast to influence where they decide to land. Keep that in mind later on. So, after all that, we're going to move on from the Cabinet War files, but there was so much information there that I really wanted to get it all across to break down this, break down the misconceptions and also highlight how important the invasion of Norway was in terms of the defence of the UK and the assessment of the invasion threats that faced it. We're going to come on to my favourite files now, which are the war diaries. So I was trying, after doing all this, I tried to have a look at what the reaction in the UK was. So, yeah, one of the reasons that it's taken me so long to make this video and to do it has been that I was hoping to find a lot of the information I needed in the war diaries relating to the threat of invasion during or after the fall of Norway and Denmark. And this simply didn't happen. So I start by taking a look at the command and division war diaries I had available for the units of the Home Force in April 1940, and I was massively surprised to see that there was actually very little available from what I found anyway. You might, if you've got war diaries for elsewhere, you might be able to prove me wrong on this, which if you do, please let me know, because I'm really happy to, or very interested to see what the situation was like elsewhere, because I don't have war diaries for the entirety of the UK. I'm just focusing on East Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and Norfolk for the time being. But I had hoped that the information in their war diaries would provide me an insight, and I was massively disappointed. So, yeah, I was surprised that I found actually little in regards to invasion of Norway and Denmark. But around the time, several of the divisions, which I do have information for, issued emergency orders or updates to their operation orders. So that, but in hindsight now, that doesn't really matter that I wasn't able to find this information, because I was able to find the Cabinet War files, which gave me a wealth of information, so much information that I'm quite well catered for now. But that's a bit of an insight into what I found from looking at the units on the ground within the Home Force of the UK. So here's just like a couple of snippets what I was able to find in regards to in the war diary. So I'll go and itch your nose again. And I wanted to include these just to show that the Home Force units on the ground were proactive and reacted to the increased invasion threat and didn't just sit around doing nothing. They updated their levels of readiness to counter invasion and also put additional plans in place to defend their areas of responsibility. So let's start with the 197th Brigade. So the 197th Brigade were frontline brigade deployed to defend Durham, Northumberland and parts of North Yorkshire, so they were located within Northern Command. And on the 12th of April 1940 they issued an update to their operation order. So they issued operation order number 3 on the 12th of April 1940, and this is one of the few orders that I could actually find which actually references the invasion of Norway. So this order went out within 4 days of the invasion commencing. This document or operation order outlines their responsibilities in terms of defending their area. So they highlights that they were responsible for coastal and aerodrome defence, and the units under their command I like this particular sentence. It was the responsibility or the intention of the units under their command to pounce on and destroy the enemy. So they're going to pounce and destroy the enemy or enemy forces that land within their subsector. So again, taken extremely seriously, it was going to be their responsibility to fight the invading force as it landed. They weren't going to sit back and do nothing. They were going to be proactive and attack. So this document also outlines important details such as the brigade or the brigades, the units under the brigade would be at 24 hours readiness. So that is, they would be ready to operate at 24 hours notice and move out. The document also provides information on how the battalions in the brigade will move, and interestingly mainly by bus, which they weren't all going to hop on a bus and buy tickets and travel off. There were buses allotted to the brigade to allow the units to move. They weren't all just going to hop on the number 25 bus and head off to the coast for a jolly. They had requisition buses to allow them to move, and there's also a lot of assessment of what equipment they would take with them as this part of the process of moving off to attack the enemy. The 18th Division, which were based in Norfolk, so one of my key units I'm looking at the minute, issued the quite nicely titled Operation Order Seagull on the 22nd of April 1940, and this order again outlined their plan for defending their area in the event of enemy action. So they were focused primarily on raids or the landing of infantry on the coast to raid the coast rather than full-blown invasion, which is quite interesting, and also naval tip and run raids. So that is the German Kriegsmarine turning up, bombarding the coast and buggering off sharpish, and they were primarily focused on the area of Lowestoft to the Wash. But yeah, what I found interesting is that their key concern was small-scale raids rather than a full-blown invasion, which is very interesting, and also naval tip and run raids, which is not something I'd seen mentioned in the COSC assessments. So very, very interesting stuff. Coming back to the north again, looking at the 66th Division. So on the 24th of April 1944, the 66th were deployed as a reserve division in Yorkshire, and they issued the Home Defence Emergency Scheme 1940 on the 24th of April. So this also outlined the plan for defence of their area in reserve, as well as a broad overview of the invasion threat. So with the area, what's interesting here is that they highlighted that the area of the Humber was the most practical area for an enemy landing of a seaborne force in Northern Command's area. So interestingly, the figures that they provided for the estimated enemy forces available are those actually quoted in the Julius Caesar plan from months before, which I found quite interesting. It's also interesting that despite the COSC assessment, the 66th Division, in terms of their deployment within Northern Command, determined that the Humber was most likely the area that an enemy landing would take place. So we've seen that the COSC determined that an invading force was most likely to land between the Wash to Harwich at this time, to Newhaven at this time, but the 66th Division within Northern Command had a different perspective on this. And I thought I'd mention this because this shows quite clearly that these local units further didn't just sit back and sit back because the higher ups had determined that their area wasn't a likely landing area. These local units still had to act on their initiative and would defend their area as they saw fit, and still aim to defend the areas that they thought were highly vulnerable in their given area. So they, although we've got this clear information from the top brass saying the invasion force is most likely to land between the Wash and Newhaven, later revised down to Folkestone, the local units had a completely different perspective, and this is why it's useful or extremely important to look at these local units to assess what their perspective was, because although we have this higher level stuff, this didn't necessarily filter down to local areas. There was a vast amount of variation at a local area, and this is something that rarely goes researched. Generally, the overarching picture is looked at, and the local picture is rarely considered. So this is a key thing that I want to get across in these presentations, is to try and give you an insight into the high level stuff and the local stuff, to show you that we don't see a lot of information, because a lot of the time the only thing that's ever been looked at is the high level stuff. Right, so after 45 minutes of me talking, or nearly 45 minutes of me talking, let's start to draw this to a close. So as always, that's enough for one day. I'm going to draw this talk to a close, but just to kind of conclude in a professional capacity or in a more professional way. Excuse me. So just to kind of conclude the talk, the CAB files, the Cabinet War files, clearly demonstrate how the invasion threat was constantly assessed and how plans were changed by the top brass in the military, primarily the Chiefs of Staff Committee and the Joint Intelligence Subcommittee, and how these two kind of work together to inform the defence of the UK, and how this situation was constantly changing, was constantly changing, was fluid, was not fixed, was not static. So a lot of information was processed to try and determine current and future enemy action and further assess how best to defend the UK. Again, flying in the face of this misguided perception that the defence of the UK was not taken seriously and was not prepared in any way, shape or form. Right, so there is a vast wealth of information, and we can clearly see a lot of time and effort went into determining the threats to the UK as seen by the British military, and how this would have ultimately been used to influence how the Home Forces themselves and units deployed under the Home Forces would have defended the UK. So obviously these units that were deployed were the regular and territorial army units, because at the time the Home Guard didn't even exist, and even when the Home Guard were formed a couple of months later, you know, they were not instantly given frontline roles and responsibility of defence, as we'll see in later videos. But this is a story I'll go into in much later detail in the future, as I say. So, as always, I hope these videos further demonstrate, you know, what I constantly bang on about, in that the invasion threat was much more extensive than often realised, and that the invasion threat evolved over a long period of time, becoming more and more serious for the defenders over this period of time. I also clearly hope that I've demonstrated the effect of the fall of Norway and Denmark, and the effect this had on the plans of defending the UK, and how the action of the enemy changed strategic defensive planning and also changed the potential for future action, and how this may affect the defence of the UK. Again, as always, as I like to say, you know, the South Coast, well, this all happened way before the South Coast became vulnerable to invasion, so we're only just starting to see the South Coast crop up now. And as I like to point out, just constantly rub it in, the South Coast was late to the invasion party. But in terms of my next video, we'll actually start to finally look at how the invasion threats started to reach their peak, and how the threats came about to the South Coast, and how they were perceived by the Home Forces and military top brass of the Chiefs of Staff Committee. So I'm already on with writing the next video. As always, I hope that's been useful. I hope it's made sense. I hope the presentation's, been good. As always, if you made it this far, thank you for watching. Please do, if you've not viewed the channel before, like and subscribe. Check out the other links and stuff in my bio and all that. And yeah, hopefully I'll catch you next time. Thank you so much for watching. Over and out. I'll see you later.